There are crime scenes that detectives walk into and instantly know they'll be thinking about them for the rest of their lives. But then there's Villisca, a house where silence felt louder than screams, a house that didn't just hold 8 bodies. It held a question that still claws at America more than a century later. What kind of person kills an entire family and then stays inside the house like they're not done yet? Some crimes end in blood. This one ended in shadows. Because the killer didn't leave footprints, didn't leave a motive, didn't leave a face. Just a house filled with death and a town filled with nightmares. It began on a warm June night in Iowa, in a place so small you could walk across it in minutes. Villisca was the kind of town where doors weren't locked and neighbors didn't whisper. They waved. Kids played until the porch lights came on. Families trusted the quiet, trusted the routine, trusted the dark. And maybe that was the mistake. The Moore family had spent the evening at a church program. Josiah and Sarah Moore, with their 4 kids, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul, were heading home with 2 visiting girls who asked to stay the night. It should have been a peaceful sleepover, a night of giggles and stories and summer air drifting through old wooden windows. But someone else walked into that house, someone whose footsteps would never be identified. The last lights in the house went off, beds shifted, breathing slowed. And somewhere outside in the quiet Iowa darkness, a man waited. Maybe he'd been watching the house all night. Maybe he'd already slipped inside before anyone came home. Maybe he'd been sitting in the attic, listening to the family laugh and settle in, waiting for absolute silence. No one knows. That's what makes Villisca the kind of story that traps your mind and doesn't let go. Inside the house, everything was still. The wooden floor held warmth from the day. The children slept without a single clue that death was already breathing the same air. Then, sometime deep in the night, the killer moved. A slow step, a quiet breath, a shadow passing through darker shadows. He carried an axe, not a small one, not a clean one. A farmer's axe that looked like it belonged to the land, not to murder. And yet here it was, in the hands of someone whose heart must have already been dead long before he walked into that house. The first strike was silent to the world outside. Inside the house, it was the sound of innocence ending. He attacked with a force that made experts decades later struggle to describe it. The blows weren't just meant to kill, they were meant to erase. One room, then another, then the children, then the guests. Every victim brutally struck, every life taken while they slept, unaware, defenseless. The kind of crime that doesn't come from rage, it comes from something colder. But the horror didn't stop with the killings, because after the murders, the killer stayed. He moved through the house like he belonged there. He covered the victims' faces with sheets or clothing. He hung fabric over mirrors as if he couldn't stand to see his own reflection, or didn't want the house seeing him. Imagine that. A murderer walking from room to room, adjusting the scene, touching objects, creating quiet where screams should have been. This wasn't panic. This was ritual. He took the axe, wiped it, placed it neatly. He performed acts that investigators still can't explain. He lingered. He explored. He walked through the darkness he'd created like it didn't faze him at all. Outside, the sunrise was just beginning to turn the sky pale. Inside, there was only stillness, the kind of stillness that makes your skin crawl when you realize it isn't peace. It's aftermath. Morning came. Neighbors noticed the Moore house hadn't come alive like it usually did. No kids running outside, no chores starting, no voices, just silence. One neighbor walked up to the house, knocked, called out, nothing. Another neighbor joined. Still nothing. They knew something was wrong, but even their worst fears weren't close to the truth. A relative arrived with a spare key. He hesitated at the door, like his instincts were begging him not to open it. But he did, and the moment he stepped inside, he backed out, pale, shaking, barely able to speak. He told the others not to go in. His voice was barely a whisper when he said it, but it carried enough fear to freeze everyone in place. When police arrived, they entered a house where time felt broken. The air felt heavy, like the walls themselves were holding a secret. Room by room, the nightmare unfolded. 8 bodies, every single one murdered in their sleep, every face covered, every mirror draped, every detail deliberate. Detectives had seen violence. But this was something else, something dark, calculated, controlled. And yet the killer had vanished without leaving a clean trail behind. No footprints leading away, no blood drops on the road, no forced entry that made sense, just emptiness. The town of Villisca changed that day. People locked their doors for the first time. Windows were nailed shut. Kids slept with lights on. Adults kept guns within reach. And rumors grew like wildfire. Some said the killer was a drifter. Some said it was someone local. Some whispered it was a devil walking in human skin. Because who else could commit a crime so monstrous and then disappear like smoke? What investigators didn't know then was that the case would twist itself into decades of suspects, dead ends, false confessions, and theories that still split experts today. And the deeper they looked, the stranger it got. Because certain details suggested the killer wasn't improvising. He had a plan, a pattern, maybe even other victims. The Moore house was only the beginning, or maybe it was the middle, or maybe it was just one chapter of a story America didn't realize was unfolding in its quietest towns. The most unsettling part. Some detectives believe the killer stayed inside the house hours after the murders, long enough to cook food, sit in silence, and move through the rooms like he wanted to memorize the chaos he'd created. Imagine that. A killer sitting at the family's table while the sun came up outside, and 8 bodies lay just feet away. The case didn't just go cold, it froze. It turned into a permanent question mark stamped into American true crime history. And still, that axe, that house, that night, they all point to someone who knew exactly what they were doing, and someone who never paid for it. The truth is buried somewhere between the victim's last breaths and the killer's last step out of that house. But here's the thing about Villisca. The story doesn't end with the discovery of the bodies. It only gets darker from here. Because once investigators started digging, they found signs that the killer might have done this before and might have done it again. And the clues? They don't lead to one simple answer. They lead to a maze with no exit. The Villisca house didn't just become a crime scene. It became a black hole, pulling in theories, fear, and investigators who walked in confident and walked out questioning everything they thought they knew about human violence. Because the deeper they stepped into the investigation, the stranger the details became. It wasn't just what the killer did. It was what he didn't do. He didn't break anything. He didn't steal anything. He didn't rush. He didn't leave a clear escape path. He didn't behave like a man terrified of being caught. He behaved like someone who had done this before. Detectives started mapping the scene. Every room told a different part of the same nightmare. Every bed, every sheet, every covered mirror seemed to say, this wasn't chaos, this was choreography. And behind that choreography, there had to be a mind. One cold enough to extinguish 8 lives, yet calm enough to walk through the house afterward, as if he were inspecting his own work. The sheriff walked outside at one point, leaned against the porch railing, and whispered to another officer that he felt like the killer had been watching him from inside the house. That's how heavy the atmosphere was, thick enough to make even hardened men feel followed. But the investigation had to start somewhere. And it started with the simplest question. Who would hate this family enough to do something like this? At first glance, the Moors had no enemies. They were respected, kind, involved in church, known for helping neighbors. Nothing pointed to personal revenge, so the investigators turned to the second possibility: someone passing through. Villisca sat near rail lines used by drifters, workers, and men who lived between towns. It wasn't impossible to imagine a stranger slipping in, murdering 8 people, and hopping a train before sunrise. But something didn't fit. Strangers kill for desperation, robbery, impulse, opportunity. This wasn't that. This felt like ritual. But then investigators found something chilling. Reports of other axe murders in nearby states, families killed in their sleep, all within walking distance of railroad tracks. Was this the work of one man drifting from town to town like a ghost? Some detectives believed it instantly, others refused, arguing the Villisca killer acted with too much personal intent. But the possibility stayed open, hovering over the investigation like a storm cloud. The second theory was even darker. Some believed the killer wasn't a stranger, but someone the Moors knew. Someone who knew the house layout, someone who knew where everyone slept, someone who knew how to move quietly enough to avoid waking any of the children. That idea hit the town hard. Trust cracked like glass. Neighbors looked at neighbors differently. Smiles were replaced with suspicion. Because if the killer was local, that meant he walked the same roads as everyone else, bought groceries at the same store, nodded politely to the same people he knew he'd left a house full of corpses behind. That was a fear more powerful than any stranger danger rumor could ever be. Investigators dug into the Moore family's last day. Who saw them? Who followed them? Who watched them walk home with the 2 visiting girls? Every detail became a clue, even if it wasn't one. And then came a discovery that disturbingly matched the killer's calm behavior. It looked like he had stayed inside the house long enough to cook a meal. Not just snacking, cooking, using pans, touching utensils, standing in the kitchen like a resident instead of a murderer. Imagine the mindset of someone who could do that. 8 bodies inside, blood drying on his clothes. And he walks into the kitchen and makes food like it's just another night. Some investigators believed this was a sign the killer was insane. Others believed it meant the opposite, that he was too mentally controlled, too detached, too disciplined. A man who could kill, then stand in silence, then cook, was not acting on impulse. He was acting on desire. But even with that horror, the killer left behind almost nothing useful. No good fingerprints, no clear footprints, no weapon taken, nothing stolen, nothing broken except lives. The investigation branched into more suspects, each one stranger than the last. A traveling preacher who acted bizarrely after the murders. A man who gave confusing, almost rehearsed statements. Another suspect who claimed God told him to commit acts of violence. A man with a questionable past who lived nearby. A relative with rumored grudges. A stranger seen around town that night. Every suspect gave detectives hope. And then disappointment. None of them fit perfectly. None of them lined up with the eerie control displayed inside the house. None of them explained the covered mirrors, the calm exit, the methodical brutality. And then came the most disturbing suspect of all. Someone investigators began linking to a possible chain of axe murders across multiple states. A traveling killer. A man who rode the rails, a man who killed entire families and vanished before the sun rose. But even he didn't fit every detail. It was like the Villisca house existed in its own category. Too personal for a drifter, too controlled for a madman, too planned for a random attack, too silent for a crime of passion. The more investigators learned, the less they understood. And the house itself became a character in the story. Locals whispered that the air inside felt wrong. Visitors claimed something watched them from corners. Reporters wrote that their hands shook while taking notes in the bedrooms. And officers swore the silence felt like it had weight. But the most chilling detail wasn't physical, it was emotional. Every detective reported the same sensation, like the killer wasn't gone, just unseen. As the investigation dragged on, the town started to fracture. People accused each other. Rumors turned into paranoia. Parents refused to let their children walk alone. Church sermons spoke of evil slipping into homes at night. Because if a man could kill 8 people in their sleep without waking a single one, he could kill anyone and then vanish. The case files grew thicker. Witness statements contradicted each other. Suspects rotated. Leads fizzled. Hope drained. Meanwhile, the house remained exactly as it was, a scar that refused to fade. By the time the investigation reached its most desperate stage, detectives were no longer looking for the truth. They were looking for anything that felt like it could be the truth. But the truth didn't want to be found. Some officers believed the killer boarded a train and slipped into the next town before dawn. Others believed he walked calmly out into the morning light and blended back into the community. A few believed he had stayed hidden inside the house until the search began outside, listening, waiting, holding his breath in the darkness. That idea alone made the hair on the back of grown men's necks stand up. But the strongest theory, the one whispered rather than spoken, was that the killer returned to Villisca after the murders, maybe even multiple times, watching the investigation, watching the fear, watching the town unravel. Some killers don't flee from chaos, they feed on it. And whoever murdered the Moors knew exactly how much chaos he had created. Years passed, suspects died, moved, confessed, retracted, or were proven unrelated. Trials collapsed, evidence degraded. Memories changed. Witnesses contradicted themselves. The case didn't go cold. It froze into legend. And the house remained standing like a monument to unanswered questions. Some people who visited later swore they heard footsteps. Others heard whispers. A few ran out in tears without knowing why. But the truth is harsher than ghosts. The house isn't haunted because spirits never left. It's haunted because the killer did. He walked away. He breathed fresh air. He saw another sunrise. He lived. And no one knows his name. No one knows how many more nights he walked through. No one knows if Villisca was his only masterpiece, or just his favorite. But here's the final twist, the one investigators always came back to. If the killer truly planned this, if he truly followed the family, entered the house, waited in the dark, struck one by one, covered their faces, hid his own reflection, cooked food, walked calmly out, then he didn't just escape the house, he escaped history. He slipped into time itself. 8 victims, 1 killer, 0 answers. And maybe that's the real horror of Villisca. The story doesn't end with justice. It ends with a door that never closed behind the murderer. It ends with a silence that feels like someone is still standing in the shadows, waiting. Because some crimes don't fade. They echo. And Villisca, it's still echoing.